The year was 1328, Scotland had finally won its freedom after decades of brutal warfare. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton forced England to recognize Scotland as an independent nation. Robert the Bruce, the legendary warrior king, had secured his kingdom and legacy. The First War of Scottish Independence was over, and hope filled the air, but peace is fragile. Just a year later, Robert the Bruce died, leaving a 5-year-old son, David II, as king. A regency led by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, tried to hold the kingdom together, but a child on the throne signaled weakness. The Disinherited, nobles who'd lost lands for siding with England, waited in exile, watching for their chance. The death of Bruce and the crowning of a boy king was their opportunity. The English king, Edward III, saw the treaty as a humiliation, and quietly supported the Disinherited. He saw a chance to undo his father's failures and place a loyal king on the Scottish throne. The peace Bruce fought for was built on shaky ground, and old wounds festered. Scotland's future now hung in the balance, with enemies circling and leadership in question. The stage was set for a new conflict, a second act in Scotland's fight for survival. The hard-won peace was already beginning to unravel. The shadow of war loomed once more. Scotland's fate rested on young David II, crowned at Scone in 1331, but divine right meant little without real power. Regents ruled, but when Thomas Randolph died in 1332, chaos followed. The Disinherited, led by Edward Balliol, son of a former king, saw their chance. Balliol and his exiled lords, hungry for lost lands, gathered in England. Edward III, officially at peace, secretly allowed them to prepare for invasion. In summer 1332, Balliol's small force landed at Kinghorn, Fife. They weren't counting on numbers but on surprise and Scotland's divisions. Their army was tiny, just 1,500 men, facing a kingdom still mourning Bruce. The Disinherited marched inland, determined to overturn the fragile peace. Scotland, leaderless and vulnerable, was about to be plunged back into war. The invasion had begun, and the fate of the kingdom hung by a thread. Old grievances were about to ignite a new and bloody conflict. The struggle for Scotland's soul was far from over. The Scots, led by the new regent, the Earl of Mar, quickly assembled a massive army to face Balliol. Confident and undisciplined, they camped near Perth, expecting an easy victory. Balliol's veterans struck first, crossing the river at night and launching a surprise attack on the Scottish camp. The Scots, unguarded and celebrating, were thrown into chaos. The next day, August 11, 1332, the armies clashed at Dupplin Moor. The Scots charged in a disorganized mass, funneled into a narrow front. Balliol's men-at-arms held the center, with English longbowmen on the flanks. Arrows tore into the packed Scottish ranks, causing devastation. The charge collapsed into a deadly crush. Men trampled, suffocated, slaughtered. The regent and thousands of Scots died. The army was shattered. Dupplin Moor was a brutal lesson. Discipline and tactics could destroy overwhelming numbers. The defeat echoed past disasters and foreshadowed more to come. Balliol's gamble had paid off and Scotland reeled from the shock. The Disinherited had proven their strength. The war for Scotland's future had taken a deadly turn. The kingdom's survival was now in grave doubt. The nightmare was only beginning. After Dupplin Moor, Edward Balliol seized the throne, crowned King of Scots in September 1332. He rewarded his followers and pledged fealty to Edward III of England. But Balliol's rule was hollow. He was seen as a puppet, controlling little beyond his army's reach. Bruce loyalists, led by men like Sir Andrew Murray, regrouped in the wilds. In December, Archibald Douglas led a daring raid on Balliol at Annan. Balliol fled half-dressed into England, his reign in tatters after just 3 months. His humiliating flight proved he lacked real support. The Scots' spirit of resistance was unbroken. Balliol's brief rule only hardened Scottish resolve. The fight for David II's throne and Scotland's soul continued. The war was far from over. The people would not accept a king imposed by England. The struggle for independence raged on. Balliol's expulsion was a small victory, but the threat remained. Edward III, furious, openly invaded in 1333, besieging Berwick. Guardian Archibald Douglas marched to relieve the town, but the Scots were slaughtered at Halidon Hill, another disaster. Douglas and much of the nobility were killed. Balliol was reinstalled as king. Scotland seemed broken, but resistance endured. Sir Andrew Murray, the new guardian, turned to guerrilla tactics, raids, ambushes, and sabotage. William Douglas, the flower of chivalry, led fierce bands in the hills. The English could not control the countryside. Every castle was an isolated outpost. The guerrilla war kept hope alive, tying down English troops and draining resources. The Scots refused to surrender, making occupation a nightmare for Edward III. The spirit of Robert the Bruce lived on in relentless resistance. The war became one of attrition, fought in shadows and forests. The Guardian's stubborn defiance would ultimately save Scotland. The fight for freedom was far from finished. The land itself became the Scots' greatest ally. With Scotland unsafe, young King David II and his queen fled to France in 1334, protected by the Auld Alliance. This pact with France was Scotland's lifeline against England. David found refuge at the French court, a symbol that the true Scottish kingdom endured. The alliance forced England to fight on two fronts, stretching Edward III's resources. As England's war with France escalated, Scotland gained breathing space. Guardians like Andrew Murray and Robert Stewart reclaimed castles and territory. The guerrilla war, backed by French support, turned the tide. The English grip weakened as the Scots slowly regained their land. The Auld Alliance was crucial. Scotland was never truly alone. The dream of conquest slipped from Edward III's grasp. The exiled king's presence in France kept hope alive. The fight for independence pressed on. By 1341, Bruce loyalists had reclaimed most of Scotland. David II, now 17, returned from France to a hero's welcome. Eager to prove himself, he led an invasion of England in 1346, honoring the Auld Alliance. The Scots marched south, but at Neville's Cross near Durham, disaster struck. English longbows shattered the Scottish army. David II was wounded and captured, spending 11 years as a prisoner in London. Scotland was left kingless once more, its resilience tested again. The Guardians had to govern and raise a massive ransom for their king's release. The nation faced hardship, but the will to resist endured. The struggle for freedom continued, even in the king's absence. The cost of war weighed heavily, but hope remained. Scotland's fate hung in the balance. The fight for independence was not yet over. The king's captivity became a rallying cry. David II's capture plunged Scotland into crisis. Robert Stewart became guardian, tasked with holding the kingdom together and negotiating the king's release. Edward Balliol's cause faded. He surrendered his claim in 1356, ending his role in the conflict. The focus shifted to freeing David II. Edward III demanded a colossal ransom, 100,000 merks. Years of negotiation followed, with David held in comfortable captivity, but still involved in Scottish affairs. In 1357, the Treaty of Berwick ended the war. Scotland agreed to pay the ransom in installments over 10 years. The financial burden was immense, but the king was finally freed after 11 years. The Second War of Scottish Independence was over. The kingdom had survived against all odds. The cost was high, but freedom was restored. The scars of war would last for generations. Scotland's resilience had triumphed. The Treaty of Berwick brought peace, but at a staggering cost. Heavy taxes to pay the king's ransom caused hardship and unrest. David II's reign was marked by financial struggle and political tension. Yet, Scotland had survived invasion, defeat, and captivity. Independence, won by Robert the Bruce, was defended through sacrifice and unity. The wars forged a powerful national identity and strengthened the great noble families. The monarchy learned to share power with Parliament and the nobility. The Auld Alliance with France became central to Scottish policy. When David II died childless in 1371, the crown passed peacefully to Robert Stewart, founding the Stuart dynasty. The legacy of these wars shaped Scotland's identity and future. The proud, independent nation we know today was forged in this crucible of struggle.